Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everybody to the B78 uh, Endurance Hub webinar, our ongoing webinar series. If you haven't checked out some of our older webinars, make sure you uh, log in and check out what we've talked about in the past. Today, we're rolling over into a new year, so I couldn't think of a better topic to cover than choosing a goal race and building your triathlon season. I think this is an area that people often get stuck on, and maybe it becomes a bit overwhelming. I know, if you go back 20 or 30 years, there wasn't much choice in the endurance space, especially in triathlon. There might have been a few local grassroots events that you could choose from that were in your area. And then, there was Ironman and some other bigger events back then, but they were few and far between. So, really there wasn't a ton of choice. And like that old saying goes, sometimes more choice makes it harder. And I think these days, sometimes people get a little overwhelmed with, which races they should decide to do. So my goal here today is to run through a few things and hopefully set you on the right track for 2023 and or whatever year you're watching this. All the same things apply whether you're watching this in a year from now or in 6 months from now. All the same things apply. So let's dive in here and let's get you sorted on how to choose a goal race and build out your triathlon season. So really, I think it comes down to answering 5 important questions, and then there's a 6th on here you'll see that isn't really a question. It's more just a statement and a comment that I'll dive into. But we're going to cover these questions, and I think these are the questions that you need to be able to answer, or at least investigate when you're considering, which races to pick. The first one is, does it light a fire? And I'll dive into each of these questions individually, but does it light a fire? Number 2, does it follow a reasonable progression? Number 3, what's the timeline? Number 4, what time of year is the best for you in particular? Number 5, what supporting events should you consider, if any? And the last comment that we'll dive into is to start with the end in mind. And really, my goal by the end of this is that you have some idea of how to structure a season. So, whether you're 2 months out from a race you might want to do, or 6 months, or even a full year, I hope that at the end of this, you'll have some idea of how to structure that whole process. So let's dive into the first question here. Does it light a fire? And this should be pretty self-explanatory, but really, you should pick events based on whether they excite you. If you're at a really high level, then yeah, you need a lot of supporting events to maybe get you ready for the big key events. Certainly, if you're very high level and you're doing Olympics, often they'll look at a 4-year cycle because the Olympics happen every 4 years, and sometimes they'll structure it, multiple years out. But really, for most people, I think the important thing is, does it excite you? I remember going back in my early years of racing. There was a whole series of races in my area. This was in the eastern part of Canada. And there was a series, and it really excited me because you could do all the races and you could collect points and you could kind of be overall winner for the series. And you could kind of establish yourself in that series, and it sort of led to other things. So, that really lit a fire for me. As I progressed in the sport, certainly the bigger events became more of what lit my fire. So, like making it to World Cups or doing well at Ironman, those were the things that started to light my fire. But I remember even in the early years, it was small grassroots events that I knew that I could compete at. That really lit a fire for me. And what's interesting about that is it wasn't always the big events early on that got me excited. Sometimes it was the smaller ones because I was more competitive, and I liked being at or near the front of the race. And they weren't necessarily big, world stage events. They were small local ones, but I really loved the fact that I could go out there and compete. So those would get me excited. Sometimes you'll have a bit of peer pressure from friends. Often we have groups of people that will do the same race together, and that might be the fire that gets lit for you. It might not really have anything to do with the results, or how you're going to place, but it's more to do with the social component. Like maybe it lights a fire because a whole group of you are going to travel to a race, in Hawaii or somewhere else kind of fun and exotic, and that's what gets you excited. I don't think it really matters what the answer is. I think as long as it's something that excites you. And the reason that's so important is that it's a process. It's a long process. Often people are picking races, this time of year that are happening, in the summer or at the end of the summer. That's like 8, 9, 10 months away. So you have to pick something that will get you out of bed on the hard days and excite you. You have to occasionally be able to look ahead, as much as I kind of ramble on sometimes about focusing on the process. It's really, really good and important to have an outcome that you're excited about, because on the hard days, the early mornings, the hard sets, you have to sometimes be able to look ahead and remember what's lighting your fire. So, first and foremost, if it's not creating any real excitement for you in some capacity, it's probably not the right choice. So, start there. Find something that excites you. And again, no right or wrong answers. Everybody gets hyped up about the big events, events these days, especially events like Ironman because they're so epic. But it can be something as simple as a local running race or a local triathlon event, or if you're a first timer, maybe it's your first triathlon, and that's enough. That's totally cool. Okay, question 2. Does it follow a reasonable progression? Now, by this I mean, are you excited about an Ironman event, but you've never done a triathlon and you're brand new to swim, bike, and run, and the Ironman that excites you is 2 months away? That might not be the best choice. I'm not saying it can't happen. We frequently actually have people that, they're bucket listers. They're like, I just want to do an Ironman, and they'll show up, 3, 4, 5 months in advance. And provided they're in good shape and maybe have like a really solid sporting background, they're not just coming off the couch, it is doable. You're not going to perform necessarily at a high performance level, but it's doable. I mean, the human body's amazing. Its capacity to endure is quite extraordinary. But I do strongly encourage that people follow a reasonable progression. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're brand new to the sport, you're total newbie, and you want to have a crack at triathlon. You have very little experience in swim, bike, run. Maybe you have more experience in one, but not the others. Really, I think the first reasonable progression is you pick something short and very manageable to train for. Something that's going to hopefully keep you on the right side of the injury equation. Jumping into something really long and big and hard without having, a few years experience is sometimes a mistake. So make sure it follows a reasonable progression. Likewise, maybe you've been doing this sport for a few years. Maybe you've done some Olympic distance events. Maybe you've kind of inched your way into a half Ironman, or maybe not. Maybe you've done short races and Olympic distance events, and you're keen to tackle something a little bit longer. Well, that would be a nice, reasonable progression. Likewise, if you've been doing, Olympic distance, maybe you've dabbled in a couple halves, and now you're getting the itch and the bug to do an Ironman, then that is a reasonable progression as well. So I think it's important to follow that for a number of reasons. First is that it's more enjoyable. If you go into something longer and you're fitter and you have more experience and you're a little more well trained, you're going to enjoy the process a little bit more. Secondly, it will probably keep you healthier and away from the injury equation. If you're straight off the couch and you decide you want to do Ironman in 3 months, well, that's pretty high risk because you're gonna have to put a heck of a lot of load on your body, and it may not be ready for it. So, considering the progression, definitely important. So, what's the timeline? This is a really important question to ask yourself, and by that I mean is like, what is the amount of time that you have between this race that excites you and now? And the other factor that we'll get into in the next question is it has to do with distance. But the timeline is important to consider. Obviously, if you're getting ready for a nice short race, The timeline doesn't need to be as long. If you're getting ready for something longer, then it's nice to extend the timeline a little bit. But I never want to discourage people from jumping on a start line, even if the timeline's fairly short. Especially if it's a short race. You can get ready for a sprint distance triathlon or even Olympic distance in relatively short amount of time. Um, the longer timeline you have, what that offers you is an opportunity to do slightly different types of training. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're super fit, lots of sporting experience. Maybe you've been doing triathlon for a while, and you decide, 3 months out of an Ironman that, hey, you know what, I want to take a crack at an Ironman. I mean, that's a pretty tight timeline. But it's doable, especially if you have some experience and you've been doing it for a while and it's not brand new to you. A 3 month window going into a half or a full or certainly an Olympic is a good amount of time to really train specifically for that event. Now, let's say you're a little more organized and you're coming at it 6 months in advance. Well, what this allows for is an opportunity to train in slightly different ways. So, if you're going to do an Ironman and you're 6 months out, you're not necessarily going to do full on Ironman training for that entire length of time. You probably burn yourself out, but you can break that up into two manageable chunks. So the first 3 months, maybe you'll work on something a little bit differently, like shorter, faster stuff, or building up a base or some strength. And then in the window that's pretty tight to that key race, then you start, as we say, sharpening the pencil a little bit more for that race specifically. So the timeline's important. And again, the further you work your way out from that key event, the more variability really you can incorporate into your training. Let's take a slightly more extreme example. So let's say you're really organized and you have you've had 2023 or, whatever year we're in planned out from last year and you're 12 months out. What's really nice about that is it allows you to kind of have a bit of an off season. Maybe you have a base season through the winter if you're in, a climate that's got winter. It allows you to do some other sports. So maybe you do a little bit of cross country skiing, or maybe you're doing some snowshoeing, or maybe it's not, quite that extreme. Maybe you're just doing some trail running or something that's a little bit different than just the straight up, aiming directly at that triathlon event. So again, the further you back yourself out from that event, the more variability you can have in the training. The closer you get to that event, the more specific the training should be for that particular event. Okay. Okay. Next question. This is a really important question to ask yourself. What time of year is the best? Now, one common occurrence I see with athletes is they get really excited about a certain event, and it might take place, like, let's say you live in the Northern Hemisphere. I think most of our people listening are probably from Canada or the US. So, we go through a more typical winter, or we're not Southern Hemisphere. So, let's see our race is, we pick a race that we want to do in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's say it's in March and we get really excited about it. Let's say it's Ironman New Zealand or something. And then we think, yeah, that's going to be awesome. And we don't work it backwards enough to realize that all of the hard, long miles we're going to have to do are going to have to be in the winter, unless we're able to travel or we have the freedom to travel to get to a warmer climate. So, time of year is a really important thing to consider. And again, I think people get excited about certain events and they don't necessarily think about the lead into that event. So, if you are wherever you are in the world, what I would encourage is that if you have a key race, especially if it's a long one, you are picking a time of year that allows you to do your key mileage, your longer mileage through the most favorable months. So let's take Northern Hemisphere, let's take Canada, easiest example for me to share. Let's say you're going to do an Ironman or a half Ironman or your key race, whatever it is, in August. That's a really nice timeline because it allows you all of these months, probably from maybe even as early as April, May for sure, and then certainly June, July, and August to prepare. So you're allowing yourself the most favorable time to prepare. And I think it's a really important thing to consider. Now, as you move up in higher levels, you'll see a lot of the athletes racing almost year round. Their season will bump up right into November, December. They'll take a little break and then they might start racing, Australia, New Zealand, or somewhere south early in the year. But keep in mind, a lot of those high performance athletes, the professionals, they're often, this is all they're doing. They don't have job, family to contend with, so it's a little easier for them to make the move to climates that are more favorable to prepare. So, considering the time of year, really, really important. So, once you've picked that key event, it's really important to think what are the supporting events that you should consider. Um, Now, again, this isn't a one size fits all. What I would suggest, though, is that if you have a key race and it's far enough out, that you definitely do something in the lead in. Now, again, this may depend on your work and family situation, but you want to have a race under your belt before your key race. And we often say that it's like shaking off the rust or, shaking off the dust. You don't want that first time out to be the one that's the most important for you. And even if you're doing a longer event like a half Ironman or an Ironman, uh, something as simple as a sprint race, 3, 4, 5, 6, even 10 weeks out is enough to really just kind of get you through that first experience in a race. You're going to have to wake up race morning. You're going to have to practice your race nutrition. You're going to have the, little nerves, some butterflies that you contend with, which is a good thing. You kind of have to go through all the steps. And so, let's say you can commit one or two events a year, even if you're not super hardcore into this thing. uh, Really, really recommend just getting on one start line. Now, let's say you can't get to another triathlon. Even a local running race is good. Just something where you have to get up, get on a start line, feel those race nerves a little bit, is a really, really important thing to have before your key race. Now, let's say you're fully committed to this whole process, and a lot of people are. They build out a whole season. Well, you can have different blocks in the year. So, what I encourage for people is, in that 8 to 12 week block going into your key race, maybe have one event, maybe two, but really focus on the training, especially if it's a long distance event. But further out from that, you can do some shorter, faster stuff, something that challenges you in a little bit of a different way, something that improves the higher end of the three sports. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're going to do an Ironman at the end of August. Maybe leave that June, July, August window as mostly training, so you can leave your weekends for those really key long events. Maybe in there somewhere you have an Olympic distance, maybe a half Ironman, 6-ish weeks out, that functions kind of as a training race as well, and to give you a little bit of confidence that you can go the distance. Um, but then, backing further out of that, maybe we're talking, March, April, May. You can get into some local running events. That the springtime in the northern hemisphere really is pretty ripe with running events, and certainly shorter triathlon events as well. So you can, pick and choose and, have 3 or 4 events in there that really, really help you sharpen your skills, whether it's just, going through the act of actual racing and getting kind of race tough, or, practicing transitions and that kind of thing. Nothing compares to a race for preparing you for a race, if that makes sense. So just to wrap up here, and I kind of going to sound like a bit of a broken record, but the thing I really want to emphasize is that whatever you decide to do, you should start with the end in mind. And I think this is actually one of Stephen Covey's habits of 7 habits of successful people, is that you should start with the end in mind. So I'm poaching that, but it really does ring true, particularly in the world of sport. So, most people are planning a year at a time. I think very few people, unless you're very high performance, and again, maybe looking long term, on an Olympic 4-year cycle, or most people are kind of planning a year. So pick that race that really lights a fire. That was our first thing, and it should be far enough out that it allows you some really good, reasonable time to prepare, and start there. So you're building your season, start there. Like that's the first thing you write down. And then you work it backwards. So you're like, okay, let's say this is an Ironman event. I keep using Ironman because this is, most people are kind of into the long distance, half Ironman, same thing. Even if it's Olympic distance, same thing. Pick a timeline from that you can really commit to the training. Okay. So for Ironman, certainly 12 weeks at a minimum is what you should be able to commit to do those longer training sessions. You really want to have quite a few of those long distance sessions in your body before you hit the start line. Uh, as much for your body as for your mental confidence, for the mental side of it. Um, so start there. Work it backwards. Think, okay, if I'm going to do this Ironman sometime in the summer, is there a 12-week window prior to that I can really commit to do the training properly? Okay, that's step one. And then maybe in there somewhere, maybe 3-6 ish weeks out, there's an event that kind of gets you on a start line at least once. And then if we work back further from there, you can say, okay, well, I'm really ready to go now, and I've got 10 months to this thing. So what should the first, what should the weeks prior to that key training block for my key race? So the 12-week lead in, we know what that's roughly going to look like. Okay, what's the next block out from that? Maybe I've got another 12-week block that I can work on something a little bit different. Maybe in that 12-week block, I'm working on shorter distance stuff. I'm going to do a couple sprint races, maybe an Olympic distance with like a goal kind of time that gets me fast. Like it's working a slightly different energy system. It's working a slightly different type of racing, which will ultimately help you for the latter stages, but it's not exactly the same. What's nice about that is it's a change in stimulus. So the body and the brain really love a change in stimulus. Like if you do the same thing exactly for 6 months straight, you probably fry yourself, and we don't want that. Um, it's a change up, but it's all related to the same thing. And then if we back it out even further, so again, I love using this timeline. It's January now, and let's say you're going to race in 10 months. Maybe right now you're spending 8 weeks where it's a little more playful. It's a little less structured. It's a little less hardcore. Maybe your long distance runs on the weekend or on trails, 60 to 90 minutes, pretty casual with friends. You're not worried about pace too much. You're going up and down hills, running through some mud puddles. If you're in a winter climate, maybe you're doing some cross country skiing on the weekend. All of that stuff ultimately helps. And what it does is it keeps you fresher. It's not the same thing for 10 straight months. So really starting with the end in mind and backing it out from there is a really nice way to go. Now, to keep it really simple for you, if you have these timelines, 3-month or 12-week blocks are a really nice way to go. So start with the end in mind, pick my goal race. Can I commit 12 weeks leading into that to be pretty specific about that event? Awesome. Okay, well, what's the 12-week block prior to that? That's a nice, really nice timeline to make some changes. Maybe you do a sport specific little block where you're working on your ride, your ability to ride. Or run, like whatever weakness you have, it might be a good place to focus. And then you work a 3-month block outside of that, so now we're 9 months out, and maybe that's a more of a base phase, or you're in the winter and you're doing some cross country skiing, that kind of thing. So starting with the end in mind, really, really important. Again, let's do a quick review here. Does it light a fire? Does it follow a reasonable progression? What's the timeline? What time of year is best? And what supporting events should you consider? All questions that you should ask before you map out your season. Okay, everybody, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed that presentation, and looking forward to our next week's webinar. Same time, same place. Mondays, 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Take care, everybody.